While the sky was still peaceful on the morning of December 7th, Cornelia Fort was the first American to come face-to-face with Japanese fighter planes in mid-air. What began as a routine training flight turned into a gateway to the bloody hell of Pearl Harbor in mere seconds. Today, you will witness the unshakable resistance of America's first witness to the war, a journey that began in the clouds and ended as a legend. December 7th, 1941. The time is 7:55 a.m. In the deep blue sky of Hawaii, the morning sunlight dances over the Pacific waves. Inside the cockpit of a small interstate cadet trainer, 22-year-old Cornelia Fort is giving a takeoff and landing lesson to her student. Everything is so serene, but this peace is about to be shattered by thousands of tons of steel and the roar of gunpowder. When Cornelia spotted a silver aircraft flying low on the horizon, she thought it was just a routine American patrol. But as the plane drew closer, she noticed that ominous blood-red rising sun emblem on its wings, a Japanese Zero, and that Zero was diving directly toward Cornelia's tiny, defenseless aircraft. The first bullets to hit American soil hadn't even reached Pearl Harbor yet, but Cornelia was the first American to feel the cold breath of war on the back of her neck.
The event Cornelia Fort experienced that morning was not just a chance encounter. It was the first record of a moment that changed the course of world history. At the time, Cornelia was working as a civilian flight instructor. Historians note that the Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft likely saw Cornelia's trainer not as a target, but as an obstacle in its path. However, Cornelia's reflexes in those seconds were magnificent. She snatched the controls from her student and executed a sharp, evasive maneuver. If she hadn't made that move, that small training plane would have been the first victim of the Pearl Harbor attack. Seconds before America officially entered the war, she won the first victory in the air simply by surviving.
When Cornelia miraculously landed her plane, she wasn't met by the sound of her engine, but by the roar of massive explosions rising from the harbor. As she turned her eyes toward the docks, the sight was like a dagger plunged into the heart of a nation. The USS Arizona had turned into a massive fireball, and the pride of the American Navy, the great battleships, were suffocating in clouds of black smoke. As Cornelia ran across the dust-filled runway, she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Those red circles she saw in the sky that morning had changed Cornelia's life and America's future forever. But this was not just an end. It was the beginning of a glorious march where American women would change the very tide of the war. As we close the first act of this glorious and somber story, we have a question for you. Is there a detail about the Pearl Harbor attack that surprises you, or a lesser-known fact you'd like to share? Let us know in the comments, and let's discuss this dark yet honorable day in American history together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss Cornelia's revenge in the skies and the birth of the WASP unit. The American spirit never surrenders. After that horrific morning at Pearl Harbor, there was no time for Cornelia Fort to mourn. She was in love with the sky, and she wanted revenge on those who had defiled it. However, in the early 1940s, it was considered impossible for a woman to be an active combat pilot in the American Air Force. Against the narrow-minded views that women should stay in the kitchen, not the cockpit, Cornelia had only one weapon: her immense flying skill and her unshakable love for her country. As America entered a total war, more male pilots had to be sent to the front lines. This created a desperate need for master pilots to handle logistics and ferry operations. It was at this pivotal moment, under the leadership of the legendary Nancy Love and Jacqueline Cochran, that the WAFS, Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, was born. Cornelia became one of the first women accepted into this unit. She was no longer just a flight instructor. She was a soldier in an army in the air, ferrying the heaviest, most powerful, and most dangerous warplanes from factories to the front lines.
Cornelia Fort holds the honor of being the second pilot accepted into the WAFS program. Entering this unit was as difficult as becoming a NASA astronaut today. Candidates had to have at least 200 hours of flight experience and the ability to navigate through the harshest weather conditions without advanced instruments. Cornelia and her colleagues were flying what were then cutting-edge machines, like the P-51 Mustang and the massive B-17 Flying Fortresses. The irony is this: these women were not given military status and didn't even have insurance. If they crashed, the military would simply write them off as civilian personnel. Despite this, Cornelia never hesitated for a second to take on the most dangerous missions for her country. This is the purest form of the military genius and sacrifice of American women.
With every flight, Cornelia remembered that ominous morning of December 7th. Every time she soared into the sky, she gripped the control stick as if she were personally avenging her lost friends and the burning ships at Pearl Harbor. Once, while flying a P-51 Mustang across the country and caught in a fierce storm, she said, "I survived Pearl Harbor. This storm cannot stop me." She wasn't just transporting planes. She was carrying America's will for freedom and justice on her wings. However, the brutal face of war could appear not only through enemy bullets, but sometimes at the most unexpected moment, even in your own skies. As Cornelia's story climbed toward one of the most tragic and honorable peaks in American history, fate was once again spinning its web for her. For Cornelia Fort, the sky was no longer just a blue void. It was a part of the homeland that had to be fought for, inch by inch. When she began her duty within the WAFS, the greatest obstacles she faced weren't just storms or mechanical failures. They were the rigid social prejudices of the era. Many male officers looked on with wonder and sometimes jealousy at how these elegant women could flawlessly pilot fighter planes weighing several tons. However, the moment Cornelia stepped into the cockpit, all those whispers fell silent. She listened to the engines roar like a symphony and controlled the yoke with her fingertips, as if she were touching the very soul of the aircraft. From the P-38 Lightning to the massive B-17 Flying Fortresses, she delivered every giant in the American military arsenal from one state to another, flying through freezing snowstorms and fog where visibility dropped to zero. She wasn't just a pilot. She was an ambassador carrying the signature of American military genius across the skies.
It is difficult even today to imagine the technical difficulty of the work performed by Cornelia Fort and her colleagues. Aircraft of that era did not have modern hydraulic systems. Flying a P-47 Thunderbolt or a B-24 Liberator required sheer muscle power and incredible physical endurance. For a slight woman like Cornelia, moving the massive control surfaces of these giant machines against the wind was a total war of will. Furthermore, these women flew VFR, meaning visual flight rules only. They had no radar and no advanced radio support, just a map, a compass, and that sharp American intellect. Cornelia's flight records show that she completed even the most difficult routes without a single mistake, never deviating by even a centimeter. When the military recognized this talent, they began to confidently entrust her with the deliveries of the most critical and newest aircraft models.
After every successful landing, Cornelia eagerly awaited her next mission. She believed that the destruction she witnessed on the morning of December 7th could only be compensated for by delivering more planes to the front lines. Once, at an airbase where she was making a delivery, she encountered a group of young male pilots exhausted from fatigue. She told them, "We bring these planes. You will bring freedom with them." Cornelia's dignified stance was not just the success of a single pilot, but living proof of what American women could achieve in the midst of a total war. Yet in this high-tempo, adrenaline-fueled life, tragedy continued to follow Cornelia like a shadow. Fate was about to draw that deadly lottery, the one that had missed Cornelia on December 7th, once again, this time unexpectedly from among her own allies. March 21st, 1943. A sunny but ominous day in the vast skies of Texas. Cornelia Fort was leading a flight of BT-13 Valiant trainers destined for Long Beach. Everything seemed routine, but this routine was about to be shattered by the deadly mistake of a young, inexperienced male pilot, driven by the ambition to prove himself to a female leader. One of the pilots in the formation began attempting a stunt, flying dangerously close to Cornelia's aircraft. This unnecessary and reckless maneuver in midair became the beginning of a tragic end. The planes collided. At that moment, there was only a brief crackle on the radios, and Cornelia's voice, always so calm, crying out one last effort. "Watch out!" Cornelia's left wing was shattered, and the steel wing under her magnificent control instantly turned into a chaotic heap of wreckage.
Historians describe this accident as a preventable tragedy. The pilot who caused the crash, Frank Stammy Jr., had been flying very close to Cornelia's plane, attempting a sort of dogfight simulation. However, the landing gear of Stammy's aircraft struck Cornelia's left wing, completely tearing off the wingtip. In an aircraft like the BT-13, damage of this magnitude instantly destroys the plane's aerodynamics in midair. Although Cornelia made one last move to correct the aircraft in that second, an uncontrollable spin was inevitable. Cornelia Fort was only 24 years old when she went down in history as the first female pilot to die on active duty. This crash became a bitter lesson that led to very strict reforms in pilot training and discipline within the military.
As Cornelia Fort plummeted toward the earth, just like the planes she had seen at Pearl Harbor that morning, she left a somber silence behind her. She had closed her eyes to life, not by an enemy bullet, but perhaps as a victim of the chaotic and impatient nature of war. Her family and brothers in arms were devastated by the news. Yet Cornelia's death was not an end. It became a torch that led to the WASP program being taken even more seriously and solidified the place of women in military aviation. In her flight log, found next to her wreckage at the crash site, one of the last sentences she wrote was, "If there is a price to be paid in this war, I am ready." Cornelia paid the price in the heaviest way, with her life, but her name would continue to echo in the American skies. The smoke rising from Cornelia Fort's plane as it crashed into the Texas soil did not represent an end. Rather, it fueled the fire of the greatest female resistance in American history. Her death sent shockwaves through the cold corridors of the Pentagon and deep into the conscience of the public. Voices began to rise. If a woman can give her life while ferrying the military's most valuable aircraft, she is no longer a civilian. She is a true child of this nation. When Cornelia went down in history as the first American female pilot to die on active duty, the void she left behind was one that thousands of other women were desperate to fill. Her tragedy transformed the WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots program, into a more professional, disciplined, and formidable force. Completing the route Cornelia had left unfinished in the sky had now become a debt of honor for thousands of young American women.
Following Cornelia Fort's death, the status of female pilots within the military began to be debated with serious intensity. Her sacrifice proved that women were not merely auxiliaries, but an indispensable part of the Air Force. By mid-1943, the WASP program was flooded with thousands of applications. Cornelia's story had become a watchword for these women. It is a fascinating detail that after her loss, the military completely modernized its flight discipline rules. Her sacrifice essentially laid the foundation for safety protocols that would save the lives of thousands of other pilots. American military genius is the art of achieving excellence by learning from tragedy, and Cornelia represents the most painful price of that excellence.
As Cornelia's funeral was held in her hometown of Nashville, the planes flying over her in honor were not just a farewell, they were a promise. American women had stepped out of their kitchens. They were now driving rivets in factories and reining in massive bombers in the sky. Cornelia's courage whispered a message to little girls in every corner of America. You can fly too. She might not have been able to personally take revenge on the battlefield for that dark day she witnessed at Pearl Harbor, but the women who followed the path she blazed became the architects of victory by delivering thousands of planes to the front. Cornelia Fort was no longer just a name. She was the unquenchable North Star of American aviation. By 1944, Cornelia's legacy had transformed into a massive force. WASP pilots were now flying not just training aircraft, but America's most advanced jet prototypes and the colossal B-29 superfortresses. It fell to these brave women following in Cornelia's footsteps to test planes that even male pilots deemed unflyable, those with engines prone to catching fire, or those nearly impossible to control. They were fighting a silent but vital war in the sky. Cornelia's final moment in those Texas skies stood like a warning sign in the mind of every WASP pilot. Be alert at every moment. Do your best for your country at every moment. They may not have entered direct dogfights with the enemy, but the planes they delivered became the fist that brought Berlin and Tokyo to their knees. American military power was rising on the shoulders of invisible heroes like Cornelia.
WASP pilots flew a total of more than 60 million miles during the war. This movement, pioneered by Cornelia Fort, carried out the delivery of over 12,750 aircraft. This is the pinnacle of American logistical genius. If Cornelia and her colleagues had not taken on these duties, thousands of male pilots would not have been able to go to the front, and the war might have dragged on for years. Yet, there was a dark side to this victory. When the war ended, these women were sent home without any military ceremony, despite the price Cornelia had paid. Their status went unrecognized for years. However, history never erased the first line Cornelia wrote in the skies of Pearl Harbor that morning. They were the silent partners in America's greatest victory.
The memory of Cornelia Fort turned into a legend told every night in the WASP barracks. New recruits studied her cool-headed maneuver on the morning of December 7th as a fundamental lesson. She was the symbol of the American woman who did not bow in the face of fear and never compromised on discipline. As the war drew to a close, America was now the world's greatest air power, and Cornelia's breath was in every propeller, her determination in every wing. But the true honor for Cornelia would come decades after the war ended, when the American people would remember her name once again and offer the respect she deserved at the highest level. The sky had taken her back, but history would never let her go. When Cornelia Fort ended her short but tempestuous life of 24 years in a Texas field, the calendar only marked 1943. She never saw the end of the war, America's absolute victory, or the skies she helped set free. Yet her silent farewell left such a deep scar on the soul of the American military that nothing was ever the same again. Cornelia was not just a pilot. She was the living, flying, and ultimately dying proof that an American woman could achieve anything deemed impossible. Today, in Nashville's Mount Olivet Cemetery, that modest headstone with a plane soaring above it represents not just a name, but the awakening of a nation. When Cornelia saw death with her own eyes on that bloody morning at Pearl Harbor, she did not flinch. Instead, she turned that fear into fuel and lit the pioneering fire of American military aviation.
Cornelia Fort's historical legacy continued to influence the American legislative and military systems long after her death. For a long time, WASP pilots, including Cornelia, were denied military status. However, in 1977, through a bill signed by President Jimmy Carter, Cornelia and her sisters-in-arms finally received the title of veteran. This was more than just a restoration of honor. It was the legal victory of the struggle Cornelia began in the sky that day. In 2009, this honor was crowned with the Congressional Gold Medal. Today, Cornelia's story is taught in military academies not just as a piloting lesson, but as an example of leadership and dedication in times of crisis. Her split-second decision-making on the morning of December 7th is considered one of the fundamental disciplines of modern aerial tactics. American military genius has risen on the shoulders of individuals with such foresight and wisdom as Cornelia.
The memory of Cornelia Fort lives on today, not just in history books, but in the reflection on the helmet of every female pilot flying in American skies. She was an American determined to do her best for her country, and this determination was sealed with the ultimate sacrifice. The war ended, the ships returned to port, the smoke cleared, yet the vast horizons Cornelia saw from the cockpit of that interstate cadet never closed. America never forgets its heroes, and every December 7th, as the sun rises, Cornelia Fort will continue to fly at the forefront of those invisible wings, gliding over the waves of the Pacific. She was the first witness of the sky, and now, its eternal guardian. My friends, we have reached the end of this emotional and proud journey we took with Cornelia Fort. She was a legend who saved herself from being the first victim of a world war while giving a lesson one morning, and then gave her life to win that very war. So, what does Cornelia's story tell us today? Does being a real hero require firing a gun on the front lines? Or is it about fulfilling your duty in the toughest conditions, silently but perfectly, like Cornelia? What else do you know about Cornelia or other hidden heroes of World War II that might surprise us? I will read your comments one by one Let's discuss that glorious American spirit below. As the War Room archives, we will continue to pull the brightest stars from the dusty shelves of history. Don't forget to subscribe, like our video, and ring that bell. Stay in the free skies, and farewell.